everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr. Jon Rhodes. Jon, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Really excited to have you on. You're a sports psychologist with a real interest in imagery, in grit. So lots of stuff to talk about. Let's start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm based down in Plymouth, sunny Plymouth, and I work for the University of Plymouth. I work for also City College Plymouth and run various programs, BScs, etc. with those guys, and run research programs, which are getting lots of traction down here in the Southwest and actually more globally as well. And also I'm a co-developer of a new approach called Functional Imagery Training, which I've been using quite a lot with not just in sport, but also in the military, and other areas as well, education, etc.
You've used that term imagery. You say you're a co-developer of functional imagery training, which we're going to dive into today. I mean, I think over the last sort of 22, 23 years, I've been involved in high performance sport, Jon. Whenever I raise the topic of sports psychology, most people will throw back at me visualization. That would be the first thing that they say. They might say about confidence, concentration, but visualization tends to be the one that they sort of dive into straight away. Oh, I visualize, I picture my performance, things like that. So it's quite a prominent part. I've heard it being described as the Swiss Army knife of sports psychology techniques. Is it something you've always been sort of interested in? Visualization, imagery, mental rehearsal?
No. To answer your question, no. To be honest with you, when I started out as a psychologist, I thought it's fairly useless, and I was like trying to get my head around how to actually use it. Yeah. So goal setting, straightforward. Self-talk, yeah, I get that. But how does it all come together? And so that was where I was stumbling when I started my career as a psychologist. I want to say 15 years ago now, but yeah, quite a while ago. So it's really been a journey of piecing together what works. And as we all do as psychologists or coaches, we take the golden nuggets of information that we like and we go, that's good. I'll put that in my toolkit. And, maybe that's not a great idea. Therefore, I'll leave it alone. So what I often see is that imagery is the add-on, is the thing that people generally don't get. So they kind of leave it to the end and go, well, there is stuff around imagery and just, you have to think this certain way. But Dan, actually, imagery, weirdly, is not just about imagery. It's about a holistic approach. And if you're only using imagery alone, then you're probably doing it wrong.
That's where I went wrong. I was just when I was playing golf, I was just picturing my shots. I mean, it just became so cliche. I mean, I think everybody in golf stands behind the ball, or at least if you have some interest in being good at the game, you tend to see golfers stand behind the ball, and you're taught to picture the shot. But I agree. I mean, historically, whenever I've worked with a golfer, I want them to feel the swing that they want to make. I want them to feel the strike of the ball on the club head. I want them to relate that to seeing the shot. So the feeling of the body movements, the feeling of the strike, the seeing the shot, and relate all those together. Is that really where you're coming from? It needs to be a sort of a multi-sensory experience.
Yeah, I'd say so. But also, I don't want to get too deep in the theory, but let me just explain this, right?
No, please do.
So and we've lost a few listeners already, but here we go. So the theory ultimately is if you, so golf, right? If you walk into a golf shop, you're in the shop, yep, and you look around and you see a golf club and you go, well, I mean, what's your thought? You go, a driver, look at that driver. What do you, yeah? Yep. And you start to visualize what it would be like and standing, at the tee, and then perhaps the internal monologue that goes with it, right? Yep. So interestingly, the theory really is rooted in memory, right? So if you think about, we'll go to the more working memory model primarily. I will breeze through this, but ultimately, when you're talking to yourself, and I think you had Ethan Cross on a few weeks, yep, ago, and a great show because that internal chatter is what's happening. And this internal chatter, you can hear yourself saying things, and that's your more phonological loop within that system. Okay, so we move on. So you're thinking about things, and you're saying to yourself, "Oh, how good would it be for me to pick up that club and for me to swing it at sea?" So then you then start to visualize. Okay, and when you visualize, it's a holistic process. You're visualizing your standing position. You're visualizing the movement patterns. You're visualizing even the small things, your grip, your finger position, your equilibrium of your weight, and all these small things. This is your visual spatial sketchpad that adds a bit more detail to that first chatter area. And then, as a caveat, the episodic buffer, the last bit, is really you're placed in a scene. You're placed in whether it's the driving range, whether it's on T number 7, which has been my nemesis, but not with this brand new driver. So then you start to develop these various factors. And this is really important because imagery is in 3. Imagery is not just thinking about an image. Imagery is the chatter, which formulates that image. And then you're planted somewhere. And those 3 things are really essential moving forward when thinking about how to actually use imagery and actually how to teach it as well, because you need to be very much aware of those three phases.
Can I reflect back to you what I've heard there with those 3 phases? So, and we'll use the funky psychology terms and your lovely scaffolded language alongside it. Starts potentially with the phonological loop, which is that chatter. And as you say, Ethan Cross, who was on the Sports Soak show recently, actually, I think he's got quite a bit in his book about the phonological loop. That's the inner dialogue that you're experiencing when you're thinking about, let's say, being on the first tee or being on the court or the course or the pitch or the field. That's followed by a visual spatial sketchpad, which is your bodily feelings, your kinesthetic feelings, your movement.
Yes, everything. It's literally sketching it out that image. So it could be anything. Literally any thought that comes into your head. If I say lemon, you're thinking of a lemon.
Okay.
So that thought is sketching it out.
Okay. And then the episodic buffer, which is your location. It's actually located somewhere. It could be your kitchen. It could be the first tee, as we've said. It could be the gym. It could be the swimming pool.
Yeah, exactly. And also there's often a timestamp to it as well, meaning that there is meaning behind that certain episode, that certain event. There is meaning in it. Why do you think of that one event? Well, there must be something in it which is important to you. Maybe it was a good swing on the 7th when you last, or maybe it was a bad swing, so that's why you're thinking about getting a new driver, or there's some emotional connection.
And remind me, you mentioned working memory. That's the working memory model with relation to imagery.
Yeah, so Badley and Hitch are the kind of the 2. Well, I suppose Badley is the first one who developed it, and then Hitch and added on parts of it as well. And there's been lots of research around the various functions of those areas. What we do know also, and this is a really important point off the back of that. So really fortunately, my PhD supervisor, Jackie Ondredy, was also worked with Alan Badley, and her key focus is on systems. So, for example, if you are listening to this podcast now, but someone is talking to you, then you have a choice. You listen to my dulcet tones, or you listen to someone else, but you can't choose both. So that's the dual task system.
Yeah.
So again, importantly, when we think about, and this is another key area of functional imagery training, is elaboration. We elaborate, and we when we think about things, we go through lots of detail. So this research is really based in cravings. So if you're thinking about a chocolate biscuit, you then you have a multi-sensory experience with that stimulus. What does it taste like? Where will I get one from? The cupboard downstairs in the kitchen. So then you're looking at episodic buffers. So all these various factors are important to note when you start to think about that thought. Now, I call it elaboration. Other people might call it look at attention and focus. All the same things really, but it's just the detail that you're going into.
Are you saying to me the phonological loop, visual spatial sketchpad, and the episodic buffer are part of working memory?
Yeah, so that's more multi-store model of memory. So if you think about the information coming in from the senses, this is coming in. It's being delivered to those systems. Various, obviously, it's all sensory perception coming in, and then it's being distributed to those areas.
Perfect. So if we take your chocolate biscuit example, my phonological loop, my chatter, might say, "Wow, that's delicious." My visual spatial sketchpad will actually show me a picture of a chocolate biscuit. For me, it might be a chocolate digestive or a chocolate hobnob or something like that.
Yeah.
And episodic buffer, I suppose, for me, actually, that the location would be grounded on my sofa watching TV when I have my cravings are at their fullest.
Exactly. And these three systems then create elaboration. So you're then elaborating on that thought in detail. And the more you elaborate on the thought, the more you'll want that chocolate biscuit. So sorry, mate, you might have to go and get one in a minute.
Right. So that if we just bring in Ethan Cross here again, with his book, his work on conscious mind, he would, I suppose, suggest that's this notion of zooming in. The more we elaborate, the more we're dwelling on this picture, having that internal chatter, thinking of when we've eaten or where we've eaten that chocolate biscuit, we're zooming in. And so there's more chance for us to actually act on what we're seeing, what we're experiencing.
Absolutely. You've got it. That's it.
Okay.
That's it.
All right. Yeah. So I suppose the big, bold question here, John, is, so what? What's this got to do with sport?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So what indeed? Well, let's apply it to sport.
Yep.
So let's think about a situation where you are on the even before you even get onto the first tee, you're perceiving what will happen.
Yep.
You're elaborating on it. You're looking at all the detail. You're going through that multi-sensory detail. And the interesting thing is that some of that's negative, and that's fine. But we need to manage those negative thoughts, and we need to redirect those negative thoughts so that they ultimately align to our goals, our passions, why we're doing it, and that bigger picture. So the so what bit of all of this is that we have about 2 seconds to change elaboration, to change those thoughts from being negative to positive.
Can I stop you there? Because this is really interesting, because I don't want to bypass this. You say we've got about 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Putting you on the spot slightly, how do you know that? What do you mean you've got 2 seconds? How do you know you've only got 2 seconds?
Yeah, so a lot of research has been done recently around thoughts per day. So you might call in cognitive psychology, I call them spontaneous thoughts.
Yep.
People might call them intrusive thoughts. If you're a neuroscientist, you probably call them something else. But ultimately, it's you have around 6,200 plus a day. So there's been some really good research out recently off the back of the Human Connectome project, which was a huge project looking at scanning the brain and figuring out how many thoughts people have a day, and then what they focus on and why they focus on various things. Yep. So importantly, I mean, there are other thoughts as well. I mean, clearly you have a lot more than those thoughts, but these are the thoughts that come to the surface that you then start to ruminate on and think on and that dwell on. And often when these thoughts arise, we know that, or the research tells us that you have a very short amount of time to, at that point when you start to acknowledge that thought, to try and change it. So you have about 2 seconds. Now, the interesting thing as well is, like, you think about the chocolate biscuit example, or even the example around the first hole, and you have your negative, perhaps you have a negative thought, or hole number 7 or hole number whatever, is that you have a couple of seconds to deviate that thought. And
otherwise it sticks.
Otherwise it sticks, and elaboration takes hold, and you go down the factor of well, last time I was here, this is what happened. Oh, hole number 7's my nemesis. Oh, that slight dog leg to the left. I'm not sure what club I should take today. So then you start to then go into that detail. So ultimately what we're trying to do at that point is change that point of elaboration. The difficult thing though, Dan, as well, is that primarily for those quick thoughts that arise that are things like negativity, they're very quick to rise to the surface of consciousness. The long-term great thoughts of the positivity take a little bit longer, unfortunately. So if we can try and ensure that perhaps those two thoughts start at the same time, we can then or deviate when one arrives. We can at least have some kind of control over what we elaborate on.
Let's just briefly dwell on that notion of negative thoughts being speedier than positive thoughts. I think that I'd like to get your thoughts on this, mate. I mean, speaking to Lisa Feldman Barrett, the neuroscientist on the Sports Psych show, and coming back to Ethan Cross, I put to both of them, because they're very heavily invested in this area. Lisa would talk about ambient neural activity, which is basically the neurons constantly firing, which I think is where the constant thoughts happen, where they emerge from, essentially, potentially. I put to both of them, look, do we have a negative bias? Is it possible as human beings, from an evolutionary perspective, that we have a negativity bias, that we're hardwired to scan for threats, to search inside of our body for anything that feels uncomfortable? And they both sort of, without going, yeah, absolutely 100%, they both said, yeah, we're pretty much, yeah, that's fairly accurate. And obviously in line with Martin Seligman's work on positive psychology, he would say the same thing, which is we're hardwired as human beings to orient towards the negative. It's just that sort of thought popped into my head. What's your thoughts?
My thoughts are that we can rewire.
Yeah.
It's not easy though. So actually spending time with individuals to help them reshift mindset. And I appreciate that's a whole different topic of mindset, but ultimately, what functional imagery training is based on core values, beliefs, which are ultimately mindsets and attitudes, which then dictates what you do. Ultimately, if we can then hit those core values, it takes time, perseverance, hard work, resilience, commitment, determination, etc., etc., etc. But with the right support, and again, Mustafa Sakar, who was on as well around resilience. I mean, that is the area of, we need support. We need people to support you when you're under a huge amount of challenge. And ultimately, if you have the right support team with you, then you can start to develop these new neural connections. And yes, we are hardwired in certain areas, but our beliefs, our mindset, and our grit is something which we can hugely have influence on. And if we think we cannot have influence on, then that's a big issue.
Yeah, but that's an interesting thing in and of itself. If you've got somebody in front of you who doesn't believe that they can shift, that they can change, that impacts our capacity to influence them, would you say?
Yeah, and the other interesting thing as well is that working in sports teams, if you work with a professional sports team, they are a tricky bunch to handle. Right? They are. I wouldn't say a nightmare, but they are a challenge. That's me rewiring right there, because they are a challenge. Why is that? It's because they're there. They've got professional contracts. They don't need to change. They don't believe they need to change. And what they realize over time is that all these small things, all these first steps, all these baby steps, all add up. And interestingly, what's the difference? And I've spoken to a lot of League One and League Two football players about this. What's the difference between them and Premiership players? The difference really is consistency. They're really good players, but they're also inconsistent. So if you can try and increase consistency, and this is really back to all these small things, all these small steps, having routines, having preparations where you can perceive what will happen in matches. You can look at obstacles and look at ways to overcome those obstacles. When, again, we use imagery to try and do that. then that starts to build, and that starts to plant the seeds for individuals to then change mindsets.
Take me through how you therefore can change my mindset, how I can deal with this elaboration. So let's dwell on a golf example, and then we can probably branch out into other sports. So, for example, John, geez, you mentioned having negative thoughts going onto the tee. I had an ant farm, basically, automatic negative thoughts. I had an ant farm in my head, but it interestingly, we use the term thoughts. It's so often a feeling, isn't it? It's an emotion, it's a feeling, it's affect coming through our body. And I would feel certain swing positions that would be deeply unhelpful, and I would dwell on those, and I would very much zoom into those feelings, and then by the time I got to the first tee, I'm dead. So as a look, whether it's that example, John, or it's an example of your choice, how would you use functional imagery training fit, and respecting that we got a lot of coaches listening in, and perhaps thinking about how they can potentially utilize it as well?
Okay, so two things. First off, functional imagery training as a way to change behavior. Okay, now we're all in the business of behavior change. So whatever you're doing, if you're working in sport, business, if you're working in education, we're in the business of behavior change, and that's really, really important. We're not into small modifications. We're into behavior change.
Yep.
So importantly, that and you had Professor Stephen Rolnick on, and that approach, the more Carl Rogers approach, the more humanistic approach, looking at the individual having the answers, is where I start. So motivational interviewing is the bread and butter of functional imagery training. This is what grounds it. This is the spirit of MI, and also it's understanding. There's no way that I can try and change you, because you need to change yourself, right? So how do we get to that point? I need to understand what you want to change, or maybe not. If I don't understand you, and you don't understand me and my approach, then it's lost. And so that's why you often see interventions going into clubs, and then the players saying, well, we saw the psychologist for a bit, but didn't really take any effect because, they didn't really get to know me. And that's really important. And again, I this perhaps is a message for clubs, really, because clubs need to invest more time into psychologists, because they need to get to know the players. And that's a huge important factor. A lot of consultants go in and just do a few sessions, which, they are effective, but are they effective for behavior change? Possibly not. So functional imagery training primarily would start with that. It starts in stage one, which is engaging in conversation, having a conversation which is really focused on connecting with the individual in a very non-judgmental way. It's looking at developing empathy, and this is a template. So if you buy the MI book, you've got a template. You can follow the template and look at exactly what processes to go through. And that spirit, or the philosophy, I know that you're big into your philosophies, Dan. So, and the humanistic philosophy, and understanding that the individuals have the potential to change themselves, and also they have the solutions.
Yep.
All we do as psychologists is we support them, and we support change, and we collaborate in a way which is effective for that individual. So, unfortunately, I won't be able to help your golf swing in one episode. But what I can say is that that's where I would start.
Yep.
Looking at that approach, and then really examining. So the stage 2 or process 2 is examining more around the focus or the goal. So what is your goal ultimately? What do you see yourself doing in 6 months, 6 years, whatever time? Looking at timescales and being really realistic with those as well. And the slight caveat with functional imagery training is that we use imagery to look at elaboration on all these goals. So what would it feel like if you didn't change your golf swing? You need to change it, but in 6 months' time, if you carried on doing what you were doing, what would it be like? Would you still be annoyed and frustrated and angry? And well, yeah. And so you explore that motivation. And of course, that's negative motivation, because you're going to say, well, maybe I need to change. Then you create ambivalence, which again, hopefully Stephen Rollnick would give me a high five for saying that word, because he's big on ambivalence, because it is developing discrepancies and exploring mindset in a lot more detail. And then phase or process 3 is then more evoking motivation, exploring motivation based on small steps. So what small steps do you need to change? Again, can you imagine that? What would it be like to change? So I've got a fairly good example for you, which is I've just finished a project with some ultra runners. Okay. So I decided to try and run the most bizarre research project. I mean, people like that, right? So I was like, right, let's try and run a bizarre research project. So what I know, that when we do value cards, so very MI again, that people generally rate their health as number one. So all the values. What's your value? Well, my value is my health, my family. I'm compassionate, loyal. And if you're a Miss World speechwriter, world peace is never a top value, by the way. Right? But ultimately, health is a repeated top value. So I tweeted out ages ago. I had to remove the tweet at the end because I got a lot of people messaging me saying, "Would you like help improving your health?" And I had people contact me, met them on Zoom, and then I said, gave them an MI-based group session. Explore your goals, breakout rooms, etc. Looking at why you're passionate about, about becoming healthy. What are your reasons for becoming healthy? It could be to play with the kids more, to be more energetic, to just to test myself and challenge myself, perhaps. So what we found was that in those sessions, people were engaged, and they went off in their own world. I was giving them no advice about being healthy. They came up with their own solutions. 4 months later, I contacted them and said, "Do you fancy running an ultra marathon?" Right, out of the blue. And as you can, so I had 51 in my original sample. I had 31 on the Zoom call, so 21 dropout rate from that first Zoom. When I asked the question, I had a retention of 15 people. So pretty good, right?
Wow.
15 people, pretty good.
That's high.
So I separated them into two rooms, into two groups. Group 1 had another MI-based session on problem solving around hitting the wall, or I would call it more of a choice point. And then Group 2 had functional imagery training, looking at imagining the point in which they would drop out or quit, or fatigue, or that mental chatter, or whatever it could be. So we really focused on 2 seconds. We focused on the 2 seconds of the choice point. When you decide in the morning, you know what, it's raining outside today, so I think I'll give running a miss. So we worked on those 2 seconds, and we said, really, we need to plan for those 2 seconds so that when that possible obstacle arises, we can overcome it. So 6 months later, they all sign up for various different events. So usually ultra marathons. So the guys generally did 120 kilometers. The girls did 60. And we had a retention. So 4 dropped out at that point. But weirdly, we had 100% retention from our imagery group. They all started. They didn't all finish, but they all started the race. One girl in our imagery group, she won the girls' race. These are all runners. These are all people. I didn't mention this right at the start, which I should have done, who are self-proclaimed non-runners. They're all they're teachers. They are. One's a lawyer. One's a psychologist. One's is a single mother. They're all people who just generally want to get healthy, and we challenge them to get healthy. So that project alone, we were fascinated because clearly people are more motivated. What happens when you look at obstacles, when you perceive obstacles, when you try to overcome obstacles, when you work on those elaboration points in those 2 seconds, what happens is that you take more control. And strangely, free will is actually a coached factor. Free will, your choice, your autonomy, you can coach yourself to have more free will, which is kind of a paradox, right? Because surely I've got free will, but thinking about a chocolate biscuit, how much free will do you have there? I've planted the thought, I've given you the cue, and then you're off on the free will journey. And sometimes willpower, trying to actually manage your willpower is blooming tricky. because it's tiring. But using imagery, we found that those individuals can manage it a lot better. And there has been lots and lots of research around willpower and willpower fatigue. But we're really trying to work with those individuals to try and maximize performance, but also ultimately for those guys, improve health.
There's so many directions I could take this, because I just think it's absolutely fascinating. This is an area I just love. It's, as you're speaking there, I'm thinking of effortful control, which is essentially the personality trait of conscientiousness. I'm thinking of Walter Michel's incredible study on marshmallows. I'm thinking of... I'd like to ask, therefore, I mean, obviously you can only give so many details, but just dwelling on this 2 seconds of choice point, what kind of conversations and or sort of images and imagery interventions did you engage in when you worked with these sort of future athletes?
Yeah. Okay. So it starts on 3 levels. Or through 3 levels. So level 1 is always the macro goal. The macro goal would be, it could be health, feeling healthy, feeling more energetic, feeling more empowered. What does that look like? It could also just be, for example, it could be finishing the race and the conversation you have on Monday morning after running 14 hours in the staff room. And what the conversation, did you start the race? We heard you're doing the race. Yeah, actually, I did. I started it, and this is how I got on. And that conversation, those individuals were aware that in that room, even if you fail, you started. And it's a rarity of starting those races because it's so tricky, and it's a huge challenge, of course, as well. So macro level is that feeling at the end when you've achieved. The meso level is the gap between where you currently are and where you need to be. So that is the hard work bit. That's the obstacles that are going to get in the way. The weather, the cold weather, I haven't got my shoes are broken. What can I do? It could be absolutely anything around fatigue, but also this is the comparison. This is the bit where you need to then invest time. The micro level is focusing on what can I do right now. So right now I can ensure my clothes are washed for tomorrow. I can put out my shoes on the side. I can put my socks on the radiator so they're lovely and warm in the morning. Okay, well then, can you also use imagery to go through these phases as well? So let's focus on imagery. Now this is the more the initial phases of using this approach, because clearly, when you're running an ultramarathon, or when you're running at all, for me, when I go for a run, probably about a mile in, my brain starts saying, "What are you doing? What are you running? You're not a runner," and that internal chatter. At that point, you need an intervention. So that intervention, we then work with individuals. Rather than going down that path, we look at controlling that chatter. So that chatter is, well, now we look at activating at that point the processes of macro, meso, and micro goals. So, for example, macro goal is, so I'm running a race, and for me, I'm a mile in, and I think, oh, what am I doing? I've got another, 10 miles to go. And then I go, right, well, why am I doing the race? What's it going to be like at the end? What's the conversation going to be like in X amount of time? Where am I? Where am I placed? What can I smell in that room? What can I taste? So I go through that multi-sensory area. The meso then might come into my consciousness, and I go, right, well, this is part of that journey. This is part of that hard work. I need to persevere. I need to push through. I know that it's going to be challenging and difficult. Okay, so this is kind of around acceptance. Yes, I get that. But this is a functional use of acceptance, because now we're saying, well, I'm expecting this to be hard anyway. And I know that after that first mile, probably after the second mile, the legs are feeling fine all of a sudden. This is strange. Now I've got through that first wall. I'm expecting another wall probably at mile 8. And I can have another chat with myself at that point. And then my micro imagery is, perhaps it's running 100 meters or 1K. let's work on what I can do right now. Maybe it's working on my running gait, my elbow swing. Maybe it's working on my impulse and my foot position. So it's really down to that micro level. And again, we can use imagery to think about those factors on a micro level. But that's really how we use, or I use imagery, especially in that situation. It's not an easy process because clearly people need to really believe in the process and actually adapt it and adopt things. And everyone's very different in how they use imagery. So refining imagery is what really comes in the important parts of, how do you use imagery? Everyone's ability to image is very, very different. So it's then managing that within the group.
So, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of coaches listening in. How would you advise them to utilize this? For instance, if you've got a soccer coach or a basketball coach and they know that they've got a player or players who, let's just say, have a lot of negative thoughts on the field or the court, what can they do related to this?
Okay, so two things. So for us guys as coaches and psychologists, the theory is integral and the application and the processes are really important. For an athlete, they don't care about that. All they care about is getting from A to B as fast as possible or kicking a ball in a net. So that's what you want to know, right? You want to know, how do we ensure that the consistency over time is kept and we actually increase performance? So two things. So we start off with, and I'll get onto negative imagery in a minute. We start off with what I call a lap. So I teach athletes a lap. What is a lap? A lap is locate a cue, activate your imagery, and plan for performance. So that is the sequence that I teach athletes. So I'll say to an athlete, how many laps have you had today? And they'll say, I've had 4 laps today. Okay, how did it go? Yeah, it was quite a struggle. So I had to slightly change what I was thinking. And so that dialogue in itself is hugely important. Okay, so what does that look like? So let's think about a tennis player. Tennis player could be spin of the racket is a cue. As I spin the racket, I'm going to activate my imagery. My activation of my imagery is, okay, so this point is going to go like this. I'm going to serve to that area. I'm going to expect the return to go over there. I'm going to replay. Okay, that's my, okay, fine. And now what can I do right now? Plan for performance. Right now, I'm going to serve to, the left-hand side, whatever. So right now is something that I can control, or it could be finger position, or it could be tempo. So as a golfer, it could just be, the last part is a tempo, or I feel my weight distribution. And what happens at that point? The thoughts go, elaboration, it ends, and you are then on this more of a automatic flow focus of then, moving your body and performing the skill. So that's the first part. The second part, so through the research which we've conducted, a lot of research generally with football players or soccer players if you're in America, is they go, yeah, that's great. And my their cues sometimes are, and I fill up my water bottle and I'm thinking about, I activate my imagery. I think about my match against West Ham. I don't know why I picked West Ham, but there you go. Are you a West Ham fan?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
No, I'm not. That's fine. It can be a game against
awkward.
West
Ham.
Awkward, then. That's okay. Right now, it'd be a tough game.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, very true. So ultimately, you then start to plan. You then start to use your imagery.
Yeah.
So you're using your imagery to predict what will happen, and then you're saying, what can I do right now? This is your implementation or plan. Okay, so that's great. But then players say, Rosie, I love the approach. I love it, but when I'm playing football, I don't really know how to use imagery, and I can't use it under huge amounts of pressure, Rosie. So how can you help me? And I say, okay, well, let's try and adapt it, and we refine it. So with these players, this is how the next part of this approach is adapted, is that we call it a slap. It's still a lap, LAP, but the S bit is stop and breathe and hear a breath. So you stop, hear your breath coming in, hear your breath going out. I mean, that is really a cue as well. We could argue that's a cue.
Yeah.
Locate my cue, my breathing, fine. Activate my imagery. What can I do in the next few minutes? Okay, what's it going to look like? how can I reset? And we call that, again, a slap is a reset. It's like a slap in the face. Right, I need to wake up, I need to activate, I need to energize, and then you plan. What can I do right now? So that's the functional approaches I would say to coaches. Unfortunately, unless you do your laps, unless you do your multiple laps, which are low pressure, and then you integrate your slaps. And again, the other slight caveat as well is, in sport, people use imagery only with their eyes open. You're not sitting down and closing your eyes and using imagery.
Mm.
So for me anyway, imagery is always eyes open. Why is it eyes open? It's because you're thinking about your shots. You're thinking about it in a very applied way. So don't get players to sit down, close their eyes. Get players to be active and actually engage them in the process as well.
And when they're going through lap or slap, you want them as best as they possibly can, given time constraints, to elaborate around chatter, feeling, location, if they can. Would I be right in saying that?
Yes, this is really quick. So a slap is really. This is like, could be seconds. It's usually 5 seconds of going through the focus of hearing a breath, and as I'm hearing my breath, that's my cue. And as I'm breathing in all the way in, I am thinking about, right, I need to if it's a football player, for example, I need to look at my positioning against my winger. I need to position myself better because I'm noticing that. Okay, now I'm noticing that. How would it feel? How would it look like to actually be there? To increase my performance? To actually be able to, I suppose, problem solve. What's the problem? The problem is this. The solution is this. Okay, how would it feel to do that? Good. Okay, cool. What do I need to do right now? I need to communicate, maybe. Communicate with my winger. Where do you need me? We need to increase our chat. Come on, let's go. So that is a really functional way to start to engage the process.
So what you're essentially doing there is you're asking soccer players, basketball players, whoever, to engage in effortful control in the moment, to make a choice. Because if you don't make that choice, and sometimes it can be a tough choice to make, and that choice is a skill, then you might get sucked into zoom in to the negatives. You'll elaborate the negatives rather than engaging in effortful control, executing positive actions, and then elaborating on that, or positive images and elaborating on that.
Exactly, and I'm hopeful that players will then manage their thinking, and almost slow down thinking to a point of being in a lot more self-control. We know that conscientious players that are aware of their of how to improve and connectivity with other people, we know that they're the players who generally perform better. So we're trying to slow down thinking to engage more active attention.
You've mentioned a word, grit. Can be a controversial word in our space. Some of your research is around this functional imagery training and grit. It feels like, the 2 seconds of choice point is involved in grit. However, my understanding of grit is that it's also long-term, or primarily long-term, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there. Tell me a little bit about grit. Tell me a little bit about imagery and grit.
Yeah. So grit is passion and perseverance for long-term goals. So you're spot on with your overview. Why is that important? It's important because in phase or process 2 of MI is looking at focusing on goals. So we need to look at what people are passionate about and what makes them tick. So if you've invested a lot of effort into something, then you're generally passionate. Now, of course, we can talk about passion, because passion is great and also awful. because you could be super passionate, which is called harmonious passion, and it's really directed and it's focused and it's really directed on loving what you do, that more intrinsic motivation. And of course, we can also be obsessive as well, which is that it can lead to anxiety and more turmoil around investing too much time into things that potentially we don't need to. So it's a tricky area to look at, but also the important thing, as you're saying, around grit. Yeah, grit is controversial because initially with grit, so Angela Duckworth is the researcher who made it famous
Yes.
within working with West Point Military Academy and other other faculties.
Yep.
And what she said ultimately was that grit, because it exists based on two constructs, so passion and perseverance, we can measure it. And when she measured it, it didn't really measure passion. So the single construct of grit, great, yeah, it links with performance in a way. It links with retention rates more so than other factors, but retention rates, success, yes. In the research that I've done, yeah, performance or people's perception of performance, if you increase grit, you make them work hard, you make them work more on that meso level because they can see the gap between where they are now, where they need to be. So what's in that gap? What's in those obstacles? What's in that grit? What's in that hard work? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does the sweat taste like? All those things are really, really essential. But also the controversial part is that it correlates with lots of other factors. So conscientiousness, it correlates with that. It correlates with resilience. It correlates with mental toughness. And I had Richard Thirlwell was my actually no Richard, but he was my external examiner for my Viva, and that was the first question. Grit. So what, right? Because it links with everything else, and yeah, it does. But then also, it then is a very easy way to assess mental toughness. It's also a very easy way to assess all the other factors that it correlates with. So, is it the same thing as conscientiousness? Partly. Is it conceptually different? Yes, it is. Does it correlate with performance? To an extent. So, yeah, it is a bit of a messy area. But what we do know is we can change character. So with individuals who are coming in and who are fairly gritty, we can make them more gritty. What does that look like? Unfortunately, it's a lot of hard work.
A lot of hard work, a lot of visualization.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And what's another interesting factor is that a lot of youngsters who I then, so I've interviewed lots of individuals, but and now working with a whole variety of sports and individuals who are from Olympian to grassroots, is that the Olympians generally say, I visualized, I could see my goal, and they're really young. If you read autobiographies, they'll say in there as well, at the age of 7, I knew I was going to do this. This is my path. And they were committed to their goal. And that commitment to their goal and the visualization, which got them to the point of, what does hard work look like? Who can I compare myself to? Who at the club do I know is better than me? How can I learn from that individual? And this whole factor around deliberate practice, if I know what I need to improve on, I can focus my attention, my energy, my zeal, my grit on that area. Therefore, I can then try to push those boundaries in what I do a lot more effectively.
Grit is also quite a cool name, as opposed to conscientiousness.
I'm trying to bring back zeal as well.
You have a zeal for the word zeal, right?
Absolutely.
One thing that struck me listening to you about imagery, and I've loved everything that you've said, it's really got me thinking. I do have, in my own consultancy practice, John, I do have clients who might say, well, I struggle to image, to summon up images, to see it, to feel it. Can you actually improve upon your imagery at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So imagery is a construct of two factors. So imagery is vividness and controllability.
Okay.
So I think of it like an old television. So on the one hand, you've got your frequency dial, and you kind of try to get the channels, and you're turning the channels, and a bit of static, and then you get picture. And on the other hand, you've got your volume dial. So controllability is your frequency, looking at your channels and changing your channels from left to right.
Yeah.
And vividness is then your volume, turning the sound up.
Yeah.
And you can get a very good image. So you can see, you might be able to think about a football match and how a football match is going to go, or you might look at perception around, changing those dials. But then perhaps, as you say, like the more smell sense isn't quite developed, and there's been lots of research around aphantasia, and the very, very famous Oliver Sacks, who wrote a great deal around imagery, was an individual who was aphantasic, so he could not use imagery, right? So how do you look at the various factors in increasing, or actually getting people to use multisensory imagery? Well, we have to measure it first. There are lots of scales out there where you can look at measuring various domains. In sport, usually it's the Sport Imagery Ability Questionnaire. So that's a good starting point. Generally, for vividness, we look at the VVIQ as quite a good way to start, or sensory questionnaires. So what might they ask you? I think maybe people at home may want to give it a go in terms of thinking about sensory imagery. So for taste, for example, can you imagine the taste of toothpaste? Could be one.
Yep.
Or feeling sand under your feet.
Yep.
And maybe the smell of freshly cut grass.
So you can rate these things. You can rate them from you're saying a word and I get it, so a 1, or a 5, which is as vivid as I'm now starting to sneeze because I've got I'm allergic. So you can put it on that scale, and like hearing, can you hear a siren of an ambulance? So there are ways that we can measure those various senses. And what we do know is that some people may be super images. They may get, it might be fantastic on the scale, great, whereas some are not. So when I have run sessions before, and I've done a session to a big group, and I said, can anyone think about the freshly cut grass? If you do that question and players are like, what is he? No way, I've got no idea what's going on. They usually check out of imagery. They then say, it's nonsense, I can't get it, it mustn't work for me, and they check out. Yeah.
So often I'll say to them, if for any reason you can't experience anything within that sense, catch up with me at the end, and we'll go through working one-to-one. So those parts, then, how do you actually increase someone's, like for you, Dan, it might be bringing in coffee, giving you something which is smell related. Smell this coffee, where are you? Yep. And then you going back to the phonological loop, right? And looking at, what are you saying to yourself? What episodic buffer? Whereabouts are you in the room? What are you seeing? The visual spatial sketchpad. So you can actually look at that holistic way of then integrating senses, and then removing the stimulus and trying to then look at more of a layering area. So that's one factor is vividness. Controllability is a slightly different kettle of fish, because controllability would be changing the image depending on the stimulus. So going from thinking about a football match and the first few minutes to then thinking about what it's going to be like 5 minutes before half time, thinking about what it will be in the start of after half time. So almost having segments and thinking about what's going to happen in those segments. That would be controllability. So there are ways that you can teach that. You can use video, which is quite an easy way. Pause the video, what will happen next? So almost like a way to interact and integrate perception. So there are ways that we can then develop the two factors, vividness and controllability. And as a bit of a caveat for all of these things, how does it all come together? So in a club, working with individuals, or even in businesses, working with individuals, working on imagery is a fundamental part as well, because it's about mastering a skill. So self-determination theory, looking at areas around autonomy, you doing it for you, relatedness, how we're connected to individuals, and then also mastery. How am I learning? How am I developing? How am I connecting? And using everything together to be a better version of me. So that's the kind of underlying roots. We're looking at elaboration. And fascinatingly, someone said to me recently, they said, cool, so you do all this, but what kind of what theory are you using? Like what approach is it? CBT? Is it, what is it? So, well, it's pretty much everything, because we're using mindfulness, we're using breathing techniques, we're using CBT. Yes, we are. We're using areas around potentially the ACT model, potentially, because we're looking at really connecting and committing to thought. We're also looking at, well, we're pretty much tying the whole lot together. Obviously, we're using imagery, we're using self-talk. Goal setting is fundamental. And I think if you approach sports psychology from a single point of view, from a static point of view with one model, you may struggle. If you look at sports psychology, or psychology as a whole, as a compound skill, everything really matters. This holistic approach really matters. And we know that if you approach it in that way, MI plus imagery, we know that it's hugely beneficial for behaviour change.
I love it. I love that notion of compounded mental skills, mindfulness, plus self-talk, plus imagery.
Well, I think that, I mean, all good research and all good approaches really stand on the shoulders of other great researchers. And that's really what FIT is. FIT is an approach that stands on the shoulders of other great researchers. And if you look at MI is brilliant as a starting point. If you look at meditation and mindfulness, it's great as well. CBT, I mean, there's so much research around CBT and talking therapies, but you merge them together and you get this this bigger approach, which actually has a longer lasting impact.
And I think it's brought together nicely with this multi-store model of memory, because it's giving us a framework for experience in the moment. We have chatter, we have a vision, we have feelings, and we're located somewhere. And there's a timing element to what we're doing. So there's a real structure around, for me, if I'm a coach, I can use these 3 or 4 parts of the multi-store model of memory to really ask appropriate questions around my player's experience.
Yeah, so exactly. So this is working. This is a working memory in action, working memory where we are looking at the 3 systems, where we really are developing connections with that chatter, with those images, and then looking at perception experience.
Jon, fascinating stuff. Awesome. Really, really interesting. And it's, a lot of food for thought for me, certainly. So many little things I can bring into my own practice. Mate, thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. And I know that, like all good sports psych shows, there'll be people going away with ideas, but also we'll have more questions, and we'll want to go away and research some of this stuff themselves. If they want to get more information, how can they get in contact with you? Have you got social media platforms? Can they contact you directly?
Yeah, sure. Rhodespsychology.com is probably the best place to go. That's got all my details on it. And I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, all the usual social media outputs. We do have courses as well going on in June. So if you want to learn more, we are keen to teach you as well. So yeah, thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.